genealogy. After 48 years away, Don and Elaine moved back to Lancaster County, prompted by their grandchildren's move to Maryland. The return to the county has enabled them to reconnect with other family members and their roots. Please welcome Don.
Have any descendants of J. Hoffman Hershey here? It looks like my brother and I are the only ones. And I'm not quite surprised, as you may discover as we proceed through this. Well, we'll get to that. J. Hoffman Hershey has an interesting story. And Ira Landis, who started the Mennonite Research Journal, in the very first issue of the very first volume, had a story about J. Hoffman Hershey. And J. Hoffman Hershey, my task is to help you get acquainted with this family. This was a noble family in some ways, and in other ways a tragic family. I'm a visual and I like to see pictures of things, and I'm fortunate to have access to a number of pictures that I would like to share with you. This is a studio portrait of J. Hoffman Hershey and his 9 children here, I believe. There were a total of 12 children. By the time he wrote out his will, there were 7. And so let's take a look at who we have here. This is a studio portrait of J. Hoffman Hershey. I don't know what that communicates to you, but it looks to me like someone with strength and with vision and ambition. And his wife, Barbara Buckwalter Brannaman, both born the same year. We have the J. Hoffman Hershey Family Bible and the nameplates that we have scanned. And if you can't read the writing on the plate, the text says, Jacob Hoffman Hershey, youngest son of Andrew and Mary Hershey of West Hempfield Township, and Barbara Buckwalter Brannaman, oldest daughter of Adam and Annie of Manor Township, were married the first day of October, 1844. So, what makes J. Hoffman interesting or distinguished? The first thing he needed to do was to distinguish himself from the 3 other Jake Hersheys that lived in the area. J. Hoffman lived near Salunga, and he needed to drive all the way down to Mountville to get his mail. And when he got there, he discovered that much of his mail was confused with the other 3 Jake Hersheys. So that led him to decide to change his name to J. Hoffman instead of Jacob Hershey. He and Dr. Andrew Garber organized the Farmers State Bank of Mount Joy Yesterday on the bus tour, we drove down Main Street, Mount Joy, and there were two buildings that looked old enough. I have no idea whether one of those was the bank that he started. One is currently the Wells Fargo Bank. I forget what the other bank is. Union Bank? Okay. So that would require some more exploration, I suppose. Jay Hoffman served as the first teller of that bank. He moved to Mount Joy to be near the bank, I suppose. And after a few years, the Farmers State Bank was reorganized as a national bank. And during that time, he and Abram Kaufman helped to organize the Mannheim National Bank. And he served as teller there for 3 years. Apparently, the banking industry got bored for him, and he decided to spend the rest of his career. Now, come on. Okay. To spend the rest of his career in farming and agriculture. By this time, he had acquired several farms, and the Mennonite Research Journal article states that he showed minute attention to varieties, fertilization, and tillage procedures. So he enjoyed the science side of agriculture. I didn't mention, I think I missed it, that he also served on the local school board for many years. He sent his children to the Mennonite Sunday School, conducted by Jacob Brubacher. Apparently, it was quite a controversy in the Mennonite churches in the area as to whether they should have Sunday schools or not. And Jay Hoffman was fairly progressive in this regard. You may recognize Jacob Brubacher as one who was a strong advocate for Sunday school along with the church services. Sunday schools were accepted out in some of the western states much more readily than they were in this area. So Jay Hoffman was remembered as a standby of the Landisville congregation, whose counsel was generally wise, and he was always a substantial and cheerful giver. In fact, when electricity came into Landisville, he decided it'd be a good idea to have electric in the church so they could have evening services. And he offered to pay for the installation of lights in the meeting house at Landisville. The congregation conferred and decided that they've never had evening meetings before, so why would they need electricity now? So they turned him down. He also started the cemetery, or at least the cemetery began during the time he was a member of the Landisville Church. And if you go to the to the Landisville Mennonite Cemetery, his gravestone and his wife and his family members are in the very first row next to the parking lot, and very easy to find. I was intrigued by this statement: he was good to his servants, a domestic and a coachman always. In fact, in his will, he makes provision for my faithful domestic, Martha Kaufman. One of the things we have access to is a photo album that belonged to one of the children of Jay Hoffman Hershey. It was an album that contained a slot for the standard portrait picture cards, about 4 by 6 inches each. And as I was flipping through this album, up came a picture of this person. And I said, "Mother, who is this person?" "Oh," she said, "that's great-grandfather's hired man." And his name was Stephen Miller, and she said, "He's from Colombia." When I checked the back of the photo for information, that information was written in the back. And on front, in what appears to be my grandmother's handwriting, she states that this is grandfather's hired man. The fact that there would be a studio portrait of a hired man would suggest that there was a very close relationship between the hired help and J. Hoffman Hershey and his family. I missed one thing before when I was talking about the J. Hoffman Hershey acquiring several farms. He had ended up with 4 farms, and it was helpful yesterday when Carl mentioned to our bus group that J. Hoffman Hershey had a desire to purchase or acquire and reunite much of the land that had been in his family in previous generations, but that it had somehow become sold off or divided or inherited. And apparently J. Hoffman inherited 1 or 2 of these farms, and he was able to buy, I believe it was 2 of the farms he was able to buy. So he was successful in getting those lands together. We'll go through the 12 children rather quickly here. And the first daughter was Frances. She married Henry Mayer. I'm going to put this in here. She was the one and only child of Frances and Henry, and she married a Harry Hershey. So she got the Hershey name back again. Second is Simon Andrew. He was a farmer. Simon never married. And in a taped, well, my father bought a wire recorder before, which preceded tape recorders. And back in the 50s, my father was recording his family. We have a recording of babbling baby brother Leon, and my mother playing the piano and other family things. But on several occasions, we had the recorder going when Great-Grandma Fry was there. Great-Grandma Fry was the daughter of J. Hoffman Hershey. And she explained that her brothers used to claim that they never married. They didn't marry because they haven't yet found a woman or a girl as good as their sisters. But she says, of course, he overlooked the fact that he helped raise those younger sisters. So, at any rate, Simon never married. I have no picture of Amos Hershey. I have some pictures later on of others that was taken at a family reunion in 1909. And Amos Hershey didn't live to 1909, so he was not present at that reunion. But he married Rebecca Bones. Some of the records list her as Bones. Other family records, I think the nameplate in the family Bible lists her as Rebecca Boone, as in Daniel Boone. So Bones, Boone, what's the difference? They had 2 children, both girls, and neither of these girls married. Florence and Edith. There's a childhood picture of Florence and a picture when she was an adult. My grandfather, who died when I was about 2 years old, was really enthralled with the hobby of photography, and he enjoyed taking portraits. And this is one of the portraits that he took of Florence. I think at one point Florence and Edith lived with them in the upstairs of their house in Landisville. There's a picture of Edith and an adult picture taken from the 1909 reunion. I remember these 2 women coming to our house for Christmas dinners, and they would bring with them to give to us kids a brand new shiny quarter for Christmas. 4th was an infant, don't know which gender. And then Rebecca Hershey married Hebron Hur. I think in the recording, Great-Grandma Fry explained that Hebron Hur, that 2 of her sisters married to her brothers. And she explained that the brothers were from East Lampeter Township, and when they made their courting calls, it took so long to get home that it took about 3 hours for them to get home, so that by the time they got home, it was time to get up and do the morning chores. Rebecca and Hebron had 2 daughters, Reba and Gertrude, and I don't know why I don't have adult pictures of these individuals. And then the sixth was Emma, and she married David Garber. And they had 2 sons, Benjamin F. Garber, which I would not be surprised if that was Benjamin Franklin Garber, and J. Hoffman Garber. Wouldn't be surprised if that was Jacob Hoffman Garber. And then Mary married Franklin Hur. He was a preacher at Willow Street and Strasburg. Given his age, he would have probably been at Strasburg and Willow Street as preacher when my grandfather, Christian, was preacher there, or when my grandfather, Abram, was preacher there. They had 3 children. Mabel, holding an unknown pass-around baby, as happens at family reunions. Jacob H. Hur and Miriam Bucher. I don't know anything about the Bucher that Miriam married. And then Barbara Amanda Hershey. I have no picture of her. She died at about age 5. And then my great-grandmother, Martha Jane Hershey, who married Cyrus G. Fry. Martha Jane, I put their wedding date here to relate another story. When my mother died a few years ago, we had a number of family gatherings, and we were invited to sort through her things and find something that was of interest to us to take with us. And on the last such gathering, my sister-in-law said, take whatever you want because what isn't taken today is going to get pitched tomorrow. Well, this piece caught my eye. I thought, what is this and why would my mother hang on to this for so long? It appears to be a flat stone, somewhat polished on both sides. And then I caught some faint pencil markings on the one side. It says, Luray Caves, November 9, 1883. C.G. Fry and Martha Jane Fry. I thought, oh, is this where they went on their honeymoon? Were they married? Well, they were married November 8. This was signed November 9. That raises another question. How did they get from Mount Joy to Luray Caves in one day? My mother talks about having taken the trolley to go to school. And so the trolley went through Mount Joy, apparently Landisville, Lancaster, to the train station. And from the train station, you could get to Virginia. And if you know your way around, it's not all that difficult. But one little piece of stone suggests a whole interesting piece of history that almost got lost. That raises another question. How do families decide what objects have meaning and what objects to hold on to for historical purposes? And what do we discover? You almost need a high-level degree in library science to figure this out. The other thing I might point out is her birth date and her death date. Now, I mentioned the tape recordings or the wire recordings that we have of my great-grandmother. She lived to be 1 month shy of 101 years. And one of the recordings is of an interview of my mother interviewing great-grandma Fry about her brothers and sisters and who they were married to and so on. Cyrus Fry was one of the son-in-laws that farmed one of the 4 farms. And J. Hoffman Hershey had written his will out in such a way that the 7 children that the farms would be retained and the 7 children would get the income from the farms. The farmers themselves would be paid a salary. And but when all of the children died, then the estate could be settled. And in fact, a newspaper clipping from 1960 says the will of Lancaster County farmer kept the estate intact from the day he died in 1896 until 1960. So it happens that this man was able to run his farms, keep his wide acreage intact for 64 years after his death. It gives J. Hoffman Hershey a record of 115 years as a farmer. The article by R.D. Landis says that never in the history of the Lancaster Courthouse has a will lain therein only partially executed for so long. These would be the children of Martha Jane and Cyrus. That would be my grandmother, Barbara Reist, and Walter Fry. Walter Fry had no children. Next is Abraham Lincoln Hershey. There's no picture of him because he was only 3 years old when he died. On his tombstone, his name is listed as Abram L. Hershey, but on the family nameplates in the family Bible, it's spelled out as Abraham Lincoln Hershey. And it's very clear that this family strongly supported the Union cause. Keep in mind that the Civil War was going on during many of these years. I think it was April 1861 to 1865 were the years of the Civil War. And so this family was functioning within those years. Next was Barbara Alice Hershey. She lived to be 29. And if you look at her picture carefully, this is the way she was dressed before she joined the church, and this is the way she dressed after she joined the church. She married Levi Keller Brubaker from Warwick Township, and in fact, he is buried, these two individuals were buried in the Erb Cemetery. Their tombstones we could see from the bus if you knew where to look. Her tombstone comes up to my shoulder, and his tombstone comes up to about half as high. I suspect that she might have died in childbirth because he named their daughter, their one and only daughter, Barbara Alice, after their mother. So the mother and the daughter had the same first and second names. She apparently married a Jones, but I don't know anything about Mr. Jones. We do know that she spent 12 years as a missionary in Petersburg, South Africa. In looking through my package of snapshots, I found this snapshot of Barbara Brubaker Jones, and on the back in pencil it says, "I'm the happiest person in Africa, praise Jesus. Souls repenting nearly every week." So that says something about her. This is the last of the 12, J. Hoffman Hershey Jr., and the picture on the left was taken from the family picture that you saw at the beginning. The middle picture appears where he is about 16, 18 years old, perhaps 20, and the one on the right, he is standing with his sister Barbara Alice, who died at age 29, and my great-grandmother, Martha Jane, and J. Hoffman Jr. himself lived to be 21 years old. If you will indulge me, I have a brief recording of Martha Jane Fry, which I've digitized, where she's telling the story about the horse in the snowstorm. And can we have that, please?
One time it snowed so fast, I had about a mile to go, and I had to drive towards the snow, and the horse harvest wouldn't, he refused to trot. So the snow got me ride and face, And she cut a couple steps and she'd walk. It took me such a long to get home. I started it like I always did. And I had a whip, but I wasn't going to touch her with the whip because I thought she knows how she feels. Why she refuses to go because she never seen Jackie before. And I said, I ain't going to make her. But of course, I didn't think about Mother being in suspense and wondering if I'm coming.
To know you as my father.
The one recording that we had, which somehow got lost, much to my regret, but I recall this recording being made when Great-Grandma Fry described the time when she was 7 years old, and she and her family went together to, was it the Penn Central Tracks, to watch Abraham Lincoln's funeral train go by. Now, an event that spans 2 lifetimes can't be really that too far away. So it's interesting how history can be compressed over 2 lifetimes. Yesterday we drove by the farm, J. Hoffman Hershey's farm, and that's there's the farm, and that's the farmhouse as it appears today. That's it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, what a legacy. We were learning about that yesterday, and I thought, wasn't that too bad? All that land he put back together again. He acquired some, bought some, and he was very progressive, and isn't it too bad that it split back up again? But that doesn't matter. It just, he wanted to do it. He got it done, and he passed on, and that's okay. So I just really was impressed by his passion, his desire, and he really made things happen, going, starting these banks and being the teller, and he'd get something accomplished and moved on to the next thing. So thank you for sharing that about your family, Don. We were scheduled for a break, but we want to just keep moving on. So if you want to stand up, feel free to stand up for a minute as my dad comes forward, Art Hershey. It's my mom, Joyce Huber Hershey, and that's how I got involved with the farm machinery business. So I work for the Hubers. So let me tell you a little bit about my dad, Art Hershey. He's a faithful husband, father of 4, grandfather of 15. In the 70s, he joined the rural team as a passionate dairy farmer from Chester County. That was another story. My mom and dad met at Laurelville Camp in a youth retreat, and they got married, and Dad had a passion to farm on his own. So when my grandpa, C.B. Huber, learned that his oldest daughter was moving to Chester County, he thought he'd never see her again. So anyway, we learned that wasn't, today isn't that far away. Mom and Dad are grandparents of 15 kids. I think I did say that. Anyways, as Dad, Art, became engaged in the rural program, he got immersed in the mission of their program. It's an experience that changed his life forever. He recalls the learning about politics and the importance of leadership within communities. He mentioned that one significant discovery was not that strong counties had strong leadership and struggling and decaying counties had less developed leaders. Following his participation in the rural program, in 1982, Art was elected to the House of Representatives from the 13th Legislative District, where he served until 2008. During this time, he served as chair of the Environmental and Energy Committee for 4 years and the House Agricultural Committee for 4 years. He also served for Farm Bureau county board for 4 years, and the state board for 8 years. Since his retirement, he serves as trustee for Delaware Valley University, Doylestown, Pennsylvania, and former chair of elders at his church at Mount Vernon Mennonite Church in Oxford. Along with being president of the Parkersburg Lions Club, he enjoys visits with his 15 grandchildren, supporting them through 4-H, Little League, basketball, wrestling, soccer, ballet, graduations, and scholarship programs. Recently, Mom and Dad welcomed their 2 new great-grandchildren, Wyatt Meck and Juniper Hershey. And one thing before I turn it over to you, Dad, I just wanted to share. Our church, when Dad wanted to run for office, he really wanted to run for office. And why, what's wrong with a strong Christian man being in politics? So there was some discussion about that, I recall, in our church. And, and Dad's feeling was, well, why not have a man like myself to influence things in Harrisburg? And we just had a testimony this past 2 weekends ago from his secretary. His first wasn't his first secretary, but his secretary in Harrisburg that was with him for years gave her life to the Lord because she worked for Dad. So with that, I want to turn it over to Art Hershey.
Thank you. You want to put it in there. Thank you. I want to say good afternoon. Thank the committee for inviting me. I have information on 3 railroad accidents. I got most of my information from John Ruth's book, The Earth is the Lord's, and also from the Reaper's Song, and some from obituaries now. I tried to condense it into something that would be interesting, and some people might have some information that I don't have, but we'll go from there. One thing I want to say, when we started, 2 of these accidents had a tremendous influence on the church. Around the late 1800s, our young people weren't coming to faith and joining the church till they got married. Some were going to the United Brethren Church up in Soudersburg, where they had Sunday school and young people's meeting. Other parts of the county, some were attending a Lutheran church or a Methodist church. And so there was some great awakenings and some revivals that really stirred the people, and we'll bring that out as we go. First one I'm going to talk about is Elmer Hershey from Gordonville. His brother was my senior pastor when I was a young man at Hershey. His name was Martin Hershey, and according to the obituary, this young man had a lot of promise. He had a lot of ability for public speaking, and he was looked on as a future church leader. He happened to be Carl and Andrew and Glenn's great-great-uncle. The report has it that this 17-year-old had gone to a revival meeting at Paradise Mennonite Church. Revivals held by the Reverend I.B. Good, and he surrendered his life to the Lord. He was an applicant for membership at this time. Soon after that, he attended another series of meetings at Paradise under Weaverland's impassionate I.W. Weaver. According to oral history from Glenn Hershey, he asked a young lady that evening if he could take her home. He was turned down, so he headed home alone. It says that Joe Benner was driving ahead of him. Elias Carnegie was driving behind him. According to Glenn, he was singing on his way as he headed across the railroad track in Gordonville. The high-speed train called the St. Louis Express was traveling at 80 miles an hour, and it reported in the obituary that he stopped and listened but heard nothing and then proceeded. He was hit and hurled from time to eternity. The local newspaper reported the young man's body was so horribly mutilated and carried about 150 yards. His horse was killed, and the wagon reduced to kindling wood scattered along 1/4 of a mile along the track. It is reported part of the horse was hurled through the window at the Gordonville Hotel and hit a man on the head. It's interesting, there was an inquest by H.B. Slack. H.B. Slack Sr., my wife knows H.B. Slack, the Justice of Peace, his son, and he conferred with a group of prominent leaders in Gordonville and an inquest and hearing to see if the railroad had any fault. And it turned out that they didn't. Thank you. All railroads at that time were open crossroads. What an impact this made on young people of that area. Many times we have seen how the fear of the Lord was intensified by the unusual death in a neighborhood during a revival meeting. At once, another great revival broke out among the young people of Paradise Congregation. The Gospel Herald noted, "The church has surely been built up." The next one I'm going to report on is my great-great-great-grandfather, Deacon John Hershey Jr. He would have been, Jacob was third generation, John Sr., fourth generation, John Jr., fifth generation. March 19, 1869, Deacon John Hershey Jr., happens to be my great-great-great-grandfather, was traveling with Minister Samuel Wanger, and this person I don't have much information on, but he was a preacher at Hershey Church. John Hershey was the deacon. They were going to the Lancaster Conference semi-annual meeting at Brubaker's Mennonite Meeting House in Rohrerstown. In the fall, they met at Mellinger's, they're on Route 30, and in the spring, at Brubaker's Mennonite Meeting in Rohrerstown. The ordained men met for counsel, discernment, and decision in their church duties. Hershey and Wanger took the train either from Williamstown or Gap. My dad said back in the day, Williamstown was what's now Vintage, to Lancaster. There they took public conveyance, which should be a taxi, horse and buggy, for the 4-mile ride to Brubaker Mennonite Church. After the meeting, Deacon John Hershey Jr. and Minister Samuel Wanger had dinner at a nearby home and then headed back to Salisbury Township by taking the taxi back to Lancaster to get the train. On the way, their carriage was demolished at a railroad crossing by the Columbia accommodation train. And I don't know if that was freight and passengers, but that's what it stated. There was another inquest into this, and again, it was noted that the train wasn't at fault. I was given John Hershey Jr.'s personal songbook when my father's personal belongings were divided. Many people who could afford their own songbook would buy it. The church did not provide them at that time. The book was printed in Lancaster in 1808, and I have a copy here, and I'm sure there's some around. I don't know how many, but this is in German, and there's some music lines in here, but mostly printing. It had 2 buckles on like boots used to have, but over the time they disintegrated. But I don't take it out much. I took it to Harrisburg and showed some historians about it, but I thought printed in 1808 was pretty neat. John Jr. is buried in the old Hershey Mennonite Cemetery next to his father John, and next to his father and his grandfather Jacob. Next to his brother John, that's a mistake, I'm sorry. Buried next to his brother John and his grandfather Jacob. The printing is correct, it is his father. The 2 John Hershey names on the tombstone are in the German spelling as Johann. And I had one grandson with me on a historic tour, and and we had my book along, and you can still see the dates of the birth and the death, and he said, "No, Paul," he said, "that's German spelling for John." So the Hershey family there was a get-together at Weaverland celebrating 200 years of Hershey's coming from Dauphin County to Lancaster County from 1792 to 1992, and some of those family members got a new tombstone for Jacob, which looks very nice, and I'm thinking these other two ought to be updated. I don't know if that'll happen or not. The third one was Barbara Hershey, which really woke up the church. July 25, 1896, 2 days after the quarterly mission meeting at Paradise came an event that thundered across Lancaster Conference. It happened after a Sunday evening party at the home of John Musser near the village of Whitmer. The book says the house was right at Whitmer Road on the old Philly Pike. Now, my thoughts are that that was taken down for the sheets market. If I'm not correct, why someone can inform me different. This was between Mellinger and Stumptown Meeting House. As usual, a young social set gathered from almost every point of the compass within a radius of 15 or more miles. Most of the Mennonite parentage, but as was also usual, not yet members of the church. Around midnight, 3 homeward heading couples drove east in their 3 buggies along the old Philly Pike, which crossed the tracks at Pennsylvania Railroad in Birmingham. Leading the way was Amos Landis and his girlfriend. Behind them in the middle buggy came 23-year-old Enos Barge of Refton and 18-year-old Barbara Hershey, daughter of well-known Paradise minister Peter Hershey. As the couples conversed from buggy to buggy, they did not hear the whistle of a special eastbound train loaded with troops returning from a militia encampment at Lewistown during the Spanish-American War was bearing down on them behind the Birmingham curve. Now, my father told me after this accident, there was a road, I don't know if it was to the left or to the right, but it went out around and over on the level. And he said for years after that, now my father was born in 1910. This happened in 1896. He said for years after that, his father would go up the old road and then turn on the side and go up across the track where you could see better. There was a large bank on the curve, which at that time, hardly any trains traveled at night. So it was very unusual. The Landis buggy made it across, but Barge's horse reared and stood still in the tracks. At the impact, the horse was hurled to one side, the buggy was smashed, and Barbara Hershey cut to pieces. Lying beside the track, Enos was found 30 feet from his right arm. Taken to the Lancaster Hospital on the next train west, he lingered for a day in agony, calling for Barbara, while his mother anxiously paced the corridor. The pathetic story was rehearsed in graphic detail for days and sent a thrill of horror over the county. A funeral procession of some 300 carriages took Barbara's body from her home in Paradise Township to the Hershey Meeting House, where Bishop Isaac Eby preached the sermon. At Enos Barge's funeral in Strasburg on the following day, more than 1,000 vehicles overflowed into the surrounding fields, and the borough itself, more than twice as many people stood outside as they could crowd into the old meeting house. One newspaper guessed that the 2 funerals had seen the largest attendance of sympathizing friends of anything ever held in Lancaster County. One young lady wrote later, "Oh, what a grand thing it is wrote one young woman after returning from the funeral, "To be ready when death takes us, for we know that when we need not fear to face the judge of all the earth, who it is that shall reward us according to the deeds done in the body." Indeed, many unconverted young people felt the shock of the accident as a solemn warning. It gave new power to the preaching invitations of the local ministers. It's recorded in John Ruth's book. A class of applicants baptized at Groffdale numbered 45 that fall. And later in the year, 15 were taken in at Metzler's. Extra large classes were received at Hershey, Old Road, Paradise, and Strasburg. There was talk that about 500 young people gave their life to the Lord through these revival meetings and were baptized into the church in 1896. One of these converts was just mentioned by Henry Benner was Hershey Lemon. And it's recorded in John Ruth's book that they were at a meeting, at an evangelistic service at Paradise, and about 10 of these boys were outside the back of the church just talking and having a good time, and the evangelist went out to see them after the service. Hershey Lemon protested. He said, "I don't want to be the first of his family to come forth." But as the evangelist persisted, he turned to the 10 young fellows behind him and said, "Let's go." So less than 3 weeks later, Bishop Isaac Eby baptized a group in the class that stood along the whole one side of the church and went forth. In a few weeks, the young convert began to feel that he ought to be a missionary, and shortly thereafter took the train west with only a suit on his back, a straw hat. On the way, he stopped at Scottdale, took in a Bible conference attended by other Lancaster County activists. Here, Kaufman taught on subjects such as the plan of salvation, illustrated by large written outlines in the front wall. I want to say something I personally witnessed about the middle 40s. I was born 37, and Dad said, "Hershey Lemon is speaking at Hershey Church tonight." I think it was a Thursday or Friday. It wasn't a weekend. It wasn't advertised, but he was so popular that when we got there, the church was full, and Dad and I sit next to the front bench. And we introduced Reverend Hershey Lemon. He looked out among the audience. He said, "Oh, Chris Byler." George Byler was his name. He worked for Joyce's father. George Byler was a bishop at Weavertown Amish Mennonite Church. He said, "You come on up and have devotions." He said, "Well, I didn't bring my Bible." He said, "We use the one here in the pulpit." Here was for years a family Bible there in the pulpit. I never saw another minister pick that up and read from it, but Hershey Lemon had George Byler, the bishop at Weavertown, have the devotions. While he was speaking, he reported about the Great Awakening and the baptism. He said that when he was baptized, there were 40 or more young people lined up along the side of the church that was north toward Willis Hershey Farm. He said to one side, to one end, and hope around the side, they were all baptized by Bishop Isaac Eby, and that had a lot of vibrations through the young people for years and years to come. And the question was, were these young people that were killed, were they in heaven or not? The Lord would decide that. The Lord would decide that. They said Barbara was a pretty girl. Her brother Silas, we named him Syke. He come around among the farms and worked for the government as a recorder of your wheat acreage. And he said in the book that he enjoyed working with her. She was energetic and full of fun and just an outstanding young woman. But it's too bad that her life had to be sacrificed to get people to wake up and come to know the Lord. But when I look back on our history, I just can't give enough credit to our early families that broke away from the Europe and got on those little ships and sailed over here, never saw their parents again. And I was always a student of history. And I said, too, if you want to lead into the future, you have to know where you came from. And so I got very much interested in that and got a chance to serve in the legislature, which I thank many, many supporters for doing that. It's not easy to do that. It's like running a business. You have to organize, raise money, and have fire in the belly. If you don't have fire in the belly, people pick that up. And it reminds me of a fellow run the same year I did. I knew him through the Rural Leadership Program. The newspaper asked him what the most pressing issue was in his county, and he said the price of corn. So his candidacy didn't go very far. But thank you for inviting me, and hope you enjoy the rest of the day. And like Jim Hurley said, keep looking up, and remember where we came from.
Thank you, Dad. You handled them steps pretty well.